Police of El Cerrito. I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of your day to join us on this police town hall. I'd like to introduce some of the other people that are going to be involved in this phone call with me. We have Captain Robert De La Campa, who you can see on camera live from his office. We have Sergeant Ian Wong, live from our conference room. Sergeant Wong is currently our day shift watch commander and most recently finished a 5-year stint as our detective sergeant. Elizabeth Lopez is not on camera. She's our executive assistant, and she is going to be helping us manage questions that are coming in from all of you. And Holly Charlotte is our city clerk, and she's going to help us manage comments from our participants. So with that, I'd like to say a couple of things, and then we'll get going. To start with, I'm very proud of the work that the men and women of the El Cerrito Police Department have done in the last 4 years and longer that I've been chief. They're a hardworking group of officers. They're very courageous people, and they've worked together to make some really amazing changes in how we do policing in El Cerrito. I've talked a bit to the community about some of those changes and what they've meant for policing in El Cerrito, and if you have the time, I encourage you to take a look at my comments to City Council on June 16th of this year, and also take a look at our website at some of the written documents that we've put out. We've put out documents regarding the 8 Can't Wait campaign associated with Campaign Zero. I put out some comments that I wrote about racism and how I feel about racism in our country. And I also put out a letter about my feelings around the murder of George Floyd. Today, our main goal, being here with you, is that we want to hear your comments, your concerns, and your ideas about what the future of policing can look like in El Cerrito. And we also want to take an opportunity to answer some of the questions that you might have about police practices, police procedures, and questions about why we do what we do at the El Cerrito Police Department. I want to put a caveat out there that El Cerrito is a small city, and we're working hard to make sure that our tech is up to snuff for this. So if there are glitches along the way, I hope you'll be generous with us as we work through those glitches. But our city clerk in particular has a lot of skills in here, so hopefully she's going to carry the day on getting us through this meeting. What my plan is that we're going to alternate between comments from the public as well as questions from the public. So if you are on a device that doesn't have a microphone, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat function on WebEx. You can find that on the bottom of your screen. There'll be basically a talking bubble. If you click on that, it'll open up the chat on the right side of your screen, and you can submit questions there. Ms. Lopez will help moderate some of those questions, and we'll ask her to ask questions of the group on your behalf. If you're interested in making a comment, and I really hope that many of you are here to make comments and give your thoughts and ideas, the way we will do that is we will recognize people by using the raise hand feature. So if you open up the participant list, which is the outline of a profile on the bottom of your screen, it'll bring up a list on the right for participants in the town hall session. You should notice, if you're on a computer, that there's a raise hand icon at the bottom of that list of participants. Now, if you're on other devices, you will find that raise icon at different places, but usually you'll find it when you look at the participant list. So the city clerk is going to monitor people who have raised their hand. Oh, we have somebody who just raised a hand, so it does work. The city clerk is going to monitor the hand raises, and we'll call on them in order. After you give your comments, then the city clerk will remove the hand raise, and if you later want to add more comments, you can raise your hand again, and I will put you back in the queue. Some thoughts for the group as we go through this afternoon. I want to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to get their points across and be able to share their feelings and their thoughts. So I want to make sure that we're not having everybody's getting an opportunity to talk. So if you can limit your comments to maybe 5 to 7 minutes to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to talk, we would appreciate it. And remember that if you want to come back around and have more things to say, or if more things come up as we go, feel free to raise your hand again and we can re-acknowledge you and bring you back in that way. So once again, thank you very much for joining us. And if there are questions on how to navigate the service or how to ask a question, if you use the chat feature, that'll be the easiest way for us to recognize you and get you the technical assistance you need. So with that said, it looks like we have a hand raise. which is great. It looks like Layla has her hand raised, so if the city clerk could recognize Layla, I'd appreciate it.
Layla, you can go ahead. You are unmuted.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Faiza and I live on 2650. I would like to know where all the fireworks coming from at night.
Well, I have to say, last night, I kind of felt certain that they were coming from El Cerrito because there were some really loud ones last night. But what we found working with our law enforcement partners in the area is that the majority of the fireworks seem to be coming from neighboring cities. I know that the chief of Richmond has committed to putting officers out at night to try to narrow down who's lighting the fireworks off and prevent them. But we're not the only law enforcement agency in the area dealing with fireworks. It's definitely a region-wide concern at the moment. So we're working on it. We haven't had much luck in El Cerrito. We haven't detected that a lot have been going off in El Cerrito, but they certainly are going off very close to us.
Yeah, we live on El Cerrito Hills.
Yeah, it definitely echoes out across the region up against the hill, and sometimes it does sound like they're very close. You can also see them getting launched off over in, especially closer to the water. I've noticed quite a few going up in the air over there.
Yeah.
So we're working on it, and we just put out some messaging encouraging people to please stop lighting off fireworks, especially as we're entering the summer. The fire hazard increases. There was a small brush fire over in Oakland, I think on Monday, that they believed was caused by fireworks. So it is very important for people to keep awareness around them. And we are encouraging people that if you see fireworks going off in your neighborhood, to give us a call. It doesn't mean that we're going to tell your neighbor, hey, your neighbor called on you about setting off fireworks, but we can send officers there, and if they see it happening in front of them, they can take some action.
Yeah, it's an ominous, I know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Looks like next up was Justin Rodriguez.
Justin, you can go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm a resident of El Cerrito. I have been most of my life. Recently came back home from college and staying with my folks. I particularly wanted to understand the El Cerrito Police Department's opinion on the decision to by West Contra Costa Unified School District to eliminate SROs. Yeah, I want the official ECPD opinion.
Well, we've always appreciated having our school resource officers in the schools. We felt that they were a great way for younger people to interact with law enforcement, to see them more as support people there that are there to support them and help them as a trusted source if they were being victimized in their homes or victimized at school. So we're definitely disappointed that the school district eliminated that program. We thought that there was a lot of value in it. I will say that from my personal observations, having a school resource officer program for about the last 14 years, it really did a lot to change the culture at the police department. It really helped the police department see our youth and the students in our community as part of our community, because we just interacted with them much more in a very different way than we had traditionally. When I first started here, a lot of our interactions with our community's youth had to do with when they were breaking the law or maybe they're stealing from a store. After we started the school resource officer program, our interactions became much more casual and happened less frequently in enforcement contexts. And a lot of things have changed about juvenile crime in the last 20 years that I've been in law enforcement. But I attribute a lot of the sea change in attitude at the police department to having school resource officers embedded in our agency, embedded in our schools, and having officers interact with kids on a very casual basis when they're not in crisis. So for me, it's a disappointment that the school resource officer program was canceled. I absolutely understand the perspective of the school district, and they're trying to make the best decisions for their students. So going forward, one of the things that we are working on is how we're going to change our responses to the school. We're certainly still going to be a resource for the school district, but obviously we're not going to have a big uniform presence on campus anymore. I hope that helped answer. So another thing I will add is that I received some questions in advance. So if during this we have a shortage of comments from the public, I can go through some of the email questions that we received in advance. I haven't thoroughly read them, so some of my responses are just going to kind of be off the top of my head, and it's not that I've written out a response for everything. All right, I don't see any hands raised, so I'm going to go into some of the questions that were submitted by our community members. We have this kind of broken down into general categories. So the first category of questions that we clustered had to do with department information. So one of the first questions is, what are the demographics of our officers? So let me pull my stat sheet on that. So one of the things I pride myself on, and I know our officers pride themselves on, is the diversity that's present in our agency. As far as the total police department, the racial, ethnic breakdown is that about 19% of our employees are Asian, about 11% of our employees are Black, about 29% of our employees are Latinx. We have 1.9% of our employees identify as being a part of 2 or more groups, and 37% of our employees are white. The officer breakdown is very similar, with Asians representing 20%, Black officers representing 10% of our agency, Hispanic officers representing 20% of our agency, white officers representing 46%, and 2.5% represented by 2 or more groups. Another note on the demographics of our officers is that we have a number of languages that our officers speak. We have officers that speak Spanish, Cantonese, Mandarin, Urdu, Punjabi, Hindi, French, and Vietnamese. So we do have quite a few resources at our disposal if we have victims or witnesses that where English is not their native language or they're not fluent in English. We have other things that we can bring to bear. All right, that is one question that I've checked off, and it looks like we have a hand raised from Tony Piedra. So maybe we can go to Mr. Piedra.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, I just wanted to relate an incident that took place a few months back, just to kind of get your perspective on it. I live in El Cerrito, very near to Korematsu, and there were a number of officers stationed on Donal and Manila. And as I was driving down the street, I saw 4 officers going into a home, and I saw someone, and one of the officers started his gun. And I was very worried. I was like, this looks like a very serious situation. And I drove on. Like an hour later, there's no other kind of feedback. And so I looked at the Nixle report just to see whether I could get any additional information. But what I later found out from our neighbors was that a neighbor had called the police saying that there's a suspicious figure kind of walking between the streets. And he turned out to be just the gardener of one of the residents on Norvell Street.
Mm.
Unarmed, and I think he was from Guatemala. And I guess my perception of this is that it seems like an escalation. The police seem to be escalating a problem as opposed to like trying to solve it without violence. And that seems like a pattern that we're seeing throughout the United States right now. And so I guess I would just like to know what your stance is on how can the police move forward so that they're not just, their tools are not always, you know, of violence, but are kind of minimizing de-escalation.
So you said the location is on Manila, did you say?
So it happened, so it's one of the homes on Norvell Street.
On Norvell.
And, but the police were stationed on Donal and I believe Manila. I think the actual address is 1360 Norvell Street. And I know that because the homeowner went around our neighborhood just like telling us, you know, that this incident and say, hey, this is my gardener. He's wonderful. He's been working with us forever. And it would have been very scary had she not been there to intervene, I think.
Yeah, I think while talking, it seems like I'm echoing through your microphone a little bit. There we go. So I don't know how the call came out, and what a caller says when they call the police department does tend to dictate what our response is going to look like. So I imagine if the caller had said, hey, there's a person who looks like a landscaper walking around landscaping, we probably wouldn't have gone at all. So my suspicion, based on how you said that police officers responded, is that the caller probably made it sound like a potential residential burglary was in progress, which is a serious crime. It's a felony offense, and it's one that unfortunately a lot of our residents fall victim to every year. As of the officer taking their gun out of the holster, I don't know the specifics of why that happened, but I've made some notes about the incident to look into it to see if that looks like it was a justified action or not at the time. But I will say that I have done searches of buildings that we believed a burglary had occurred in. And from time to time, officers do have their guns out when we're searching for felony suspects. Especially if you think about a residential burglar, they usually have a tool to get into the house. So sometimes they're going to have whatever burglary tool they use to force entry into a house. However, I do understand what you're saying about escalating on a call. I don't know how officers resolved it with the gardener, but it sounds like at some level they must have determined that the person was the gardener and moved on with the rest of the call response. It sounds like you probably know more from the neighbors, but it's something that I'm going to take a look at.
Thank you.
Chief, if I may interrupt momentarily, it does look like the chat feature does not allow attendees to send chat to everyone. They're all coming to me privately. So I'm going to try instead to turn on the question and answer function, which I believe will fix the problem and allow them to be able to put their questions where everyone can see them. It is a little bit, it should be a participant panel on the side for Q&A. So for those of you who are participating from home, if you can try resubmitting those questions through the Q&A, I believe that will be visible to all of the panelists on the call.
And I will add that your concern about escalating a call when de-escalating is called for is a valid concern. And our officers are trained in de-escalation. And however, there certainly is a balancing act between what exactly is the appropriate response. My expectation is even if an officer had a gun out at one point, once they realized they were dealing with a gardener, that gun got put away immediately. So there's absolutely a balancing act on police responses. In general, I find that the gun is not the first thing that officers respond with. Most frequently, from my experience with our officers and my review of their body-worn cameras, the first thing they typically respond with is their voice. And they start off by talking with people and they don't resort to force before talking with somebody. Let's see. We've got a couple of questions from the audience. So maybe I can read these off. If higher quality policing is a goal we can agree upon, doesn't it make sense to provide more training and education of officers? Does it not follow that what is needed is not lower funding, but increased funding so that officers are better trained to deal, I imagine, with things they come across on the street? I do agree that training is essential. However, I also think that officer selection is of utmost importance. That if you have somebody who is does not meet the standards of your organization or does not meet the standards of your community, there really is no way to train that person up in things like how you respond to your community members. So you have to start with high quality candidates who can be trained. So yes, I believe that training is the answer, but also employee selection and employee retention are also paired components of that. Another question is, are you willing to be part of the California State Report Card as a means of greater transparency? So I got this question last week, and I took a look at, I believe it's like a California Accountability Report Card. And it's an organization that has done a study of police departments and given them grades based on use of force, arrest demographics. And maybe Mr. Gravel can give me a thumbs up or something in the chat if I'm on the right topic. So I looked at how they did the methodology for their selection of agencies, and it looks like they decided on who would be participating in their study. They did not have agencies opt in, from what I've read. I would be absolutely fine sharing information with them. All of the things that they asked for from agencies are public records, so if they were interested in having our data as well, I would be happy to share that data. And it looks like the city clerk put in a good piece of information in the chat. We are recording this meeting, and we intend to post it on the police department website afterwards so that other city leaders who couldn't be with us today have an opportunity to hear our residents and community members' comments, and also so that other community members who were working or otherwise engaged today have an opportunity to see what we all talked about. So yes, I'd be happy to share information with the group that is doing the transparency report card on police departments. All right, how much de-escalation training do officers get in relation to overall training? Well, de-escalation is interwoven into a lot of the elements that we train for. It's a part of our crisis intervention training. It's obviously the main topic in de-escalation courses. We also use de-escalation in our use of force training, things like control holds, prone control. We use de-escalation in our deadly force training to train officers that the solution isn't always shoot at the target, but there's other solutions as well. In our general use of force training, there's a couple different ways that we do that. So we have a training group called Force Options. The two different ways Force Options tends to be delivered is through a simulator. So officers are presented with a large screen, and they go through scenario-based training with all of the different types of force options at their disposal. What happens on the screen is reactive, so that if an officer says something that the person who's running the scenario thinks is compelling, then they can change how the scenario will change with what an officer says or does. So that is one type of training that we do. Another type of force options training that we do involves simunition. So this involves live role players, where an officer once again has all of the tools at their disposal, all of the use of force options at their disposal. And part of that training is, a big part of that training is deciding what is the right force option, what are the right things to say in a given situation. And they have a live role player that will respond according to how they go through the training. So those are some examples of how de-escalation gets woven into a number of areas. Also, we have ongoing training in communications. Communications, as you can imagine, is all about de-escalation. It's about trying to accomplish things through words and not through physical actions. So I can't give you a percentage of what % of our training involves de-escalation, but it is woven through a lot of our topics. And then I see that we have more attendees now than when I first said this. So if you're new to the town hall, if you would like to speak, we have a method for activating you as a speaker. If you go to the participant list, which is the profile icon at the bottom of your screen, a list of participants will pop up on the right, and you'll see that there's a raise hand feature over there. If you click raise hand, then our city clerk can recognize you and allow you to speak to the whole group and share what your comments, thoughts, or questions are. Oh, and the city clerk asked that participants please lower their hand after they've spoken. Okay, it looks like we have MC has their hand up.
Hi there. Yeah, I wanted to know how you respond to a recent ABC7 news analysis of Bay Area arrest trends that found that Black people in El Cerrito were 13 times more likely to be arrested than white people.
So I took a look at the news piece, and one of the things that I think is concerning when we're looking at demographics is what population we choose to represent the population we're measuring against. One of the things that we look at when we look at demographics is we try to look at more than just who lays their head down at night in El Cerrito. because we really feel that our community is much more than just the people who happen to live in El Cerrito. It includes the people who come to our town to learn, the people who come to our town to work, people definitely who come to our town to shop, the people who commute into and through our town. So to me, the community of El Cerrito is a much larger entity than the 25,000 people who sleep here at night. So when we look at demographics, we tend to try to find other benchmarks that we can use to paint a more robust picture of what our community looks like. One of the benchmarks that I prefer is the demographics of our high school. We have two of the most diverse schools in the state, El Cerrito High School being one of those. And I believe that the demographics of our high school much better reflect who's coming in and out and through our town. And I run through town, not as much frequently, but I used to run a lot more often. And one of the things I do is I tend to tie my shoe at the corner of Central and Ashbury. I tighten up my laces. And if you go to Central and Ashbury, that's a pretty major intersection through town. There's a lot of people that come through there. And if you watch the drivers, you'll see that just about every race and ethnicity is represented by that intersection on a typical afternoon. I mean, you see the wealth of diversity in the Bay Area drive through that intersection. So I really don't think that the demographics of who sleeps here really represent well the demographics of the area. Are there still disparity in arrests even when we look at the demographics of the high school? Absolutely. But I don't think they are as extreme as ABC 7 pointed out when we really think of who our community represents. I hope that helped illustrate. Looks like we have Denise Sangster up next.
Hi, thank you to the El Cerrito Police for doing this. I have two questions for you. It's a two-part question. The first one has to do with recruitment of police officers, and the second is relating to retention of our existing police force. So on the recruitment end, how challenging is it to find young officers that want to come here, and why do they select El Cerrito versus other agencies? That's the first part of my question. Do you want the second half now, or do you want to wait?
What's the second one? Because maybe they might be related.
So the second one is about retention. Given the city's self-inflicted and frankly reckless financial situation that the council and the city management is responsible for, how difficult is it to keep our existing officers here and not having them feel panicked that the department may need to be seriously downsized, not because of inappropriate conduct by the police, but for pure financial reasons?
Okay, let me see if I can tackle those. The first one is, how hard is it to recruit? I would say that if it was challenging to recruit at the beginning of the year, it's going to be much more challenging now. Obviously, the national narrative plays a lot into whether or not people want to become police officers. I also believe that we are quite picky on who we decide to make police officers. They have to be people of high character. And so we do tend to go through a lot of applicants trying to find the right person for the job. Some of the things that we value in our recruits are, as you could have heard from earlier in our demographics, is language skills. We very highly value people with language skills other than English. It is a challenge. El Cerrito is also a smaller city. It doesn't have as many different position opportunities as other cities in the Bay Area. Things like eliminating the SRO position are probably not going to help with our recruitment. That represented another type of policing that people could do and that people were attracted to and interested in. As far as the question of why do they come to El Cerrito, some of them come because they have a lot of the applicants that come and end up becoming officers here. They come because they have some sort of connection to El Cerrito. I teach at a local regional police academy, and some of the applicants that have come through our door have been connections through that academy. Some people have come through our door because they know police officers here, and a lot of people that come here because they're from the area and see El Cerrito as a smaller agency where they can create close co-worker bonds with the people that work here, and they can give back to the community that they grew up in. I would say the two most common reasons that people say why they want to be a police officer when I interview them are they want to help and give back to their community, and they want to make the relationship between the police and their communities better. Our officers are very socially conscious. Many of our officers are in the millennial generation. I'd say most of them are. And they come with a very robust understanding of their responsibility in society and their responsibility to their fellow human beings. So they are very high quality people. How hard is it to keep them? Boy, it is hard to keep people sometimes. Now, I will say that sometimes when people leave the agency, it's for the best. We have a particular philosophy and mentality here that is very community oriented, and we're also very internally critical of how we do our job. And if we find that we're not doing something at a high level in a way that we want to represent, then we're not ashamed to make changes and change around and do policing a different way than, you know, the old school way of how policing has always been done. So that's not for everybody. And there are some people that come here and say, this agency isn't a right fit. This isn't the type of policing I want to do. And they go off to another agency. And I think for the most part, that's good for them. And that's just fine for us. But it is the draw of making more money in another city is a very real and tangible thing for our officers. There is a lot of competition for a very small pool of officers, so that any officer in El Cerrito, the kinds of skills they develop here are very highly sought after in other regional areas. There are a lot of cities that are facing financial distress right now, so I know we're not alone in that regard, but it is definitely a constant concern for us. It looks like Andrew Brown may be up next with a question.
Andrew, are you still with us?
I think that some wires got crossed. I did not have a question.
Okay.
Hey, if you could kindly just lower your, oh, you know what? It does. I'm looking at the icons, Chief. Do you see some of them have a hand and some of them have a question mark? I believe they're on this list if they submitted something through the Q&A.
Got it. Okay. Well, in that case, let's move to Leslie Adams next.
Hi there. Am I unmuted?
You are unmuted.
Okay, thank you. I had a couple questions. Going way back, earlier, there was someone who spoke about a situation on Norvell. And I just wanted to bring up another thing that happened that I didn't end up seeing in Nixle that my neighbor told me about. She was very upset that she had seen this situation where a handcuffed man was sitting on, it was Waldo and Ohlone, I believe. And a police officer was yelling at him in his face. So close. And this was just a couple of weeks ago. So, you know, when people were supposed to be wearing masks. At the same time, there were numerous other police officers around. And one of them came up to my neighbor and kind of intimidated her to feel that she would leave. So that's one thing. And I don't know why it didn't show up in Nixle. Second thing is just like relating to the budgets and the percentage of the city budget that goes to the police department. I've heard a number of 30%. And also how much do police officers make in El Cerrito compared to other areas? Do they make a less, more, etc.? Thank you so much.
Sure. I wrote down some notes from this incident on the BART path so that I can follow up on it and look into it. I will say that not every police action makes it on the Nixle log. We try to do just crime, so I'm not really sure what happened around this particular incident. Some of the things that we don't put on there are mental health committals. Not that that's necessarily what that was. I would hope it wasn't if that's how the officer was interacting. I'm really curious to find out what it is, period. So I must put some notes down on that to look into that. As far as the question of what percentage of the budget the police department represents, it is about 30%. There, in the most recently passed budget, there were quite a few budget cuts across the city, and the police department took a comparable amount of cuts. So I believe that going into the current budget year, it is still about 30% overall of the city's budget. The pay that our officers get is typically based on surveys of agencies that are similarly situated in the county and in the region. So some of the cities that they're compared against are Pinole, Hercules, Walnut Creek, Richmond, San Pablo, Antioch, Pittsburgh, Pleasant Hill, Martinez, I think a couple of agencies in Alameda County. And the typical goal of the city is to keep their officers at about the median level. So they try to keep officer compensation in about the middle of the pack. The starting officer here, I believe, makes around $87,000 a year. And that is pretty much the middle of the pack in the county. It may be a little bit low because of the delay in getting the most recent contract signed, but that is more or less been the practice of the city. All right, moving on to the next raised hand, we have Miguel Espino.
Yeah, hi. Actually, it's Sherry Drobner.
Oh, hi.
Hello. So a couple of questions. One is, I just wanted to do follow-up about, I noticed you were changing the demographics so that the racial disparities number would look different. So could you just follow up and let us know what that number became when you changed those demographics?
I have not done that analysis with the KGO data yet, but I can say that the census shows that I believe our African-American population is around 7 to 8%. I believe the population at our high schools around 20%, and focusing on African-American because that's what the KGO story focused on. So I think the population of our high school is a little over 20%. So I don't know what effect that would have on the overall arrest numbers because I haven't made the comparison following the KGO story yet. It's just been a busy time.
Okay. And then just the follow-up, since people are sort of talking about encounters, I did want to bring something up because it bothered us for a long time when, you know, we've always appreciated the fact that we've been able to publicly go out and express our First Amendment rights. And but we did have an incident after an event where there was a gentleman who might have been inebriated, and this was over by El Cerrito Plaza, and a police car pulled up, and the car like sort of screeched to a halt, and the officer like opened his window, and then he screamed at us and said, "Did you see that man? Did you see what he did?" And apparently he had urinated on a planter. And we said no, but then it proceeded to where he went to this gentleman who it turned out he didn't speak English. He wasn't inebriated. And by the time the incident finished, there were 2 police cars, 4 officers, and similar to what the other woman described too. The officer was screaming at this man, and it was very aggressive. And then we actually, my husband translated, you know, because the louder you talk doesn't change whether someone understands you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, so it just, by the time the whole thing settled, it just seemed like an incident that didn't need to be so aggressive. And it felt like also a lot of resources involved in someone who really just needed to probably dry out, you know, and get a little help. So
yeah, I agree. The louder you talk to somebody doesn't necessarily mean they're going to understand you any better. I think we talked about that one previously, and that is something that we talked with staff about afterwards. So definitely potentially not the officers at their best. Let's see, we've got some questions that have been stacking up in our side here. So I want to see if we can get to a couple of those before we get to our next speaker.
And Chief, I can actually now confirm the list that we see of pending speakers and questions is going in order. So if, for example, the next person on the list is Katie Sell, she has submitted a question in the Q&A, and she submitted that question before Jacqueline Torres raised her hand. So you can actually go down the list and either answer from the Q&A written questions, or if they have a hand raised, it's because they've asked to speak.
Got it. I'm a total rookie at this, so I appreciate the help. All right, so
as we all are.
Going down the order, it looks like we have a question. Are all police positions currently filled? I will say that all the positions are currently filled that are going to be filled. We currently have 39 sworn officers and an officer lined up to be a trainee to replace an anticipated vacancy in the coming year. We are holding back from our previous fully staffed number of 45. We're holding back 6 vacancies compared to what we would have looked like fully staffed back in March. So some things have changed that fully staffed number. We've held back a community liaison officer. Our 2 SROs have been eliminated as positions due to the budget cut by the district and the decisions by the district. And we have 3 other positions that are in the problem-oriented policing category that are also not being filled. So all the sworn positions are filled that are going to be filled. We also have some non-sworn positions that have some vacancies as well. We have 2 vacancies in our record section that it's questionable whether or not we're going to be filling them this fiscal year. Let's see, Katie Sell is up next. This question is, are there alternatives available to calling the police when police presence might not be warranted? For example, dealing with someone who is suffering from a mental health episode and or dealing with homeless residents. Absolutely. One of the alternatives available is to just not call the police. We have people call us pretty frequently, giving us the scenario like, there's somebody and they're standing near the intersection of Potrero and San Pablo, just as an example, and they're screaming at people and I want an officer to go check on them. You know, we've talked with our officers and our officers are not supposed to respond to calls like that because there's nothing illegal about yelling. And if we talk to people who got reported to be yelling during the day, we would be talking to them all day long. There are people that just spend their time and that's what they do. So it absolutely is an option to not call the police. There are county options available as well through 211 that you can call and ask for the county to provide a response. So the county has some mental health resources at their disposal. They are a little bit limited. They may not be an immediate response, but it'll go into their queue of responses. So you can call the county to help with mental health issues as well as with homeless related issues. So I can tell you that there are people every day that don't call us about homeless issues because there are plenty of homeless things going on around town that we don't get phone calls about. When people call us about people experiencing homelessness, we try to take note of who the person is, and we also try to figure out what is the nature of the call. If the call is that the person is homeless, we try not to go to those too. I'm not saying 100% we never go to them, but we try not to go to those calls because being homeless in and of itself is not against the law. We do get a lot of calls that sound like this. There's a person down on the ground. They haven't been moving for a long time. I'm concerned about their physical well-being. Can you please have an officer respond? We get those types of calls a lot related to homeless people. And when our officers go out, the main goal is to assess whether or not the person is physically okay, to provide some outreach and offer them some homeless services, and then to conclude the contact. We're not in the business of criminalizing the state of being homeless. So the main resources for that do come from the county. However, there are other nonprofits that offer homeless resources. There are some outreach groups, particularly in the city of Richmond, that can also help with homeless residents. Okay, let's see. I've got a hand up from Jacqueline Torres.
Hi, my question is really similar along the lines with the previous question. And it sounds like from what you're saying that you're seeing the resources available to support mental health, medical, supporting unhoused people at the county level. Sounds like they're not adequate. It sounds like they take a lot of time, they're limited in scope. I'm wondering if you can reflect on, what would your ideal scenario be in terms of resources provided by the city of El Cerrito or the county, or ideally both, that would really provide, a robust response for some of these scenarios in which police officers are not necessarily trained. It's not really the appropriate scenario, and their mere presence, even if they're not intending for this to happen, could end up escalating the situation, like domestic violence scenarios where, the mere presence of kind of law enforcement could end up ramping things up. So, we've learned, I think, in this last month about a lot of models, such as in Oregon, the Cahoots program, and others. But I'm just, yeah, wondering if you can reflect on what your ideal, set of resources would be to support some of these other kind of non-criminal circumstances in which, as community members, we might want to have a well-being check. We're concerned about the well-being of people in our community, but don't want to call the police because of what that means. Even if it's, you're well-trained and you're going to de-escalate, but even the symbolic, you being there might end up escalating kind of, family violence or, a mental health circumstance.
Well, I'm going to address domestic violence first. In my experience, when we're called because someone's being physically assaulted, that moment usually comes because everything else the people have tried has not worked out. Where the situation in the home has escalated to such a point that physical violence is occurring. Now, you're right that as a police officer, we do have, there's a lot of restrictions on how we go to a domestic violence call. The first restriction is a legislative restriction that if we determine that a crime has happened, we are obligated to make an arrest in a domestic violence incident. There's zero tolerance for people who are physically violent with their intimate partner. So that if a police officer goes to a domestic violence incident, they are obligated to take action if the elements of the crime are met. That doesn't mean that there isn't or shouldn't be other resources for people that are experiencing conflict in their relationships. And there are a number of agencies in the county that do provide counseling services, that provide outreach to people who are suffering domestic violence that don't necessarily involve the police. Their Stand Against Domestic Violence is one of the big nonprofit groups in the county. I think in my ideal world, there would be a robust regional approach to mental health and homelessness issues. I think one of the challenges of thinking of mental health in El Cerrito as a standalone non-police response is that calls about mental health don't necessarily come 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. They come at all moments of the day, and they come in all different shapes and forms. They come as a person in a house wielding a knife, threatening to hurt their family members and hurt themselves. They come as a person calling up and saying that they have suicidal ideations and want help with that. They come as somebody comatose on the side of the road, or they come as a family calling because they believe their family member might be suicidal and they haven't heard from the person in 2 hours and they believe the person's going off to go jump off a bridge, as an example of something we had recently. So because they are so multifaceted, I wouldn't say that all those types of things should be dealt with by, let's say, a therapist. I believe there will be a police element to all of those types of responses. And because we're talking about a type of incident that can occur at any time of the day, it would be really hard to dedicate a person to be on 24 hours a day to respond to those calls. Also combined with the fact that in a typical year, we might get about 180, 150 mental health evaluation calls. So they don't happen all day long. They don't happen on a constant basis. We might go a couple of days never having a call for a mental health. So I think for me, a robust regional response would be my ideal, that there would be a robust team, ideally through the county, and that law enforcement would still play a role to make sure that therapists and social workers are safe during interactions where they think that violence is a potential, but that as far as interacting with people, that therapists could take the main role. Unfortunately, because I believe that most therapists will want to have access to a law enforcement officer, and a lot of these things where people have had a history of weapons, that I don't know that there's any real savings. It's not so many calls that we have officers dedicated just to mental health responses. So I think there will still be a call that police are typically called upon to assist with. As far as the homeless, I know that there are a lot of areas like Oakland and San Francisco that have passed ballot measures to increase funding for homeless and have much more robust homeless responses. I would love something like that in Contra Costa County, to have our county homeless effort well funded and well prepared to provide housing and resources to people. Unfortunately, we haven't had that kind of support from voters to have dedicated funding sources of the same nature that they have in Alameda County and San Francisco County. But that also would be an ideal for me. It is frustrating to our officers that we really don't have a lot to offer homeless people. We try not to bother them. We try to let them, live their life. When we do come across them, we offer them services. We try to get them connected with county homeless efforts. The county team, there is a county team that works in West Contra Costa County, and we make referrals to them when we see people in need. In our county, police really aren't the first responder on the homeless issue. Sorry, in our city, we really do try to pass along information to county health so that they can do hopefully more effective interventions with homeless people. And they said that a person who's experiencing homelessness will sometimes need up to 18 different outreach events sometimes before they'll actually accept services. So homelessness is an absolutely persistent and frustrating problem. I hope that the county can identify a ballot measure like they did in other areas close to us to get a countywide response that is better funded and more robust. I would love that. That would be great.
Maybe I could just add something to that too. I think it might be informative for the public to just know really how it works here. So if a person comes to our attention, the officers discuss what's going on with them, and they determine that that person is a threat to themselves, a threat to others, or gravely disabled to the point that they cannot take care of themselves. Those are the 3 criteria for them to be put on a mental health hold, is what you would call it. The procedure in this county is, barring violence, we will not put hands on them. We will not physically detain them at all. We summon an ambulance from the county, and they are taken from the scene via an ambulance to the county's hospital. So that is how really 95% of these interactions happen. So our officers at no point handcuff them, at no point literally even touch them. My opinion is that with all the public awareness, it would be nice if maybe some changes could happen at the county level, because the law is that person is subject to being evaluated for a 72-hour period. In my experience, that basically never happens. Possibly because of budgets, I don't know, but there's not enough room at the county. So most people get out within an hour, and they continue to have the problems that we were there for the first time and repeatedly deal with. So in my opinion, that's where a big hole is in the system. That certainly needs more attention from the public.
Okay, moving on to the next one. We have a question next from, let's see if I can locate it, Aaron Reich. Could you please address your thinking as to why you felt it necessary to have a canine unit? So we use police canine units for a number of different types of uses at the police department. We use them to search for somebody maybe who is engaged in a foot pursuit with police officers. We use canine units to help assist officers in searches for illegal drugs. We also use canines to help assist officers in searching for people who may have gone missing from their homes. And we also use canines as a resource to help take people into custody. So the reason we felt it was necessary is that it adds another option to our disposal. Canine brings a different sense to the table altogether. They have a keen sense of smell. It helps them locate people and help us apprehend people. Also, we found that when we deploy a canine, we don't always need to actually deploy the canine. A lot of times, if someone is hiding in a home because they're doing a burglary, they'll just self-surrender at the thought that a canine might be used as part of a search. So I think those are kind of our main 4 reasons why we thought a canine would be helpful. I would say that our canines are used very infrequently as far as an apprehension tool. We much more frequently use them to search. Being a former detective, I can tell you that when I've searched homes before, you wouldn't believe the small places a normal average sized person can squeeze themselves into to avoid being captured. and they are very helpful when we have a report of a residential burglary to have us do a walkthrough of the house with the canine unit to make sure that the suspect isn't still hiding in the house, especially when we believe we've interrupted a burglary. And I would say they're probably their most frequent use, other than a missing person that we think might be in the neighborhood, is when we have a call of a burglary in progress and we want to have a more specialized searcher on scene to help identify where the suspect is if they're hiding on the property. Let's see who's up next. I've apologize, I've lost track a little bit on our questions on the side.
So the next person on the list is actually Justin Rodriguez, and he did have his hand raised to speak.
Great, Mr. Rodriguez.
Hi, thank you. I was originally going to ask about resources on homelessness, but I don't think that's necessarily valuable since you've talked about it already. But I wanted to instead ask about I saw it asked in the chat, and I'm not sure if it was answered, but specifically around the issue of the El Cerrito Police Union. And the police union thing is a tricky one for me because, you know, I am generally in support of unions. I mean, they've been very helpful in my family. But, you know, I'm sure we've all seen instances of, you know, in bigger cities of, you know, the union being kind of used to avoid disciplinary action, or, you know, officers being, I guess, still kept on the force, or, you know, hired at different police departments. I'm wondering, particularly in El Cerrito, I was looking over the latest memorandum of understanding, and I was wondering if you could clarify something for me.
I hope I can.
Yeah, there's an article, I believe 22, around disciplinary action.
Okay.
It says, the city agrees that no disciplinary action against an employee covered by this memorandum of understanding, which action involves a loss or reduction of pay, or discharge, shall be imposed unless such action is recommended by the chief of police in a pre-disciplinary, quote, Skelly notice delivered to the employee within 1 year, without exception, after the date of the incident giving rise to the disciplinary action, or within 1 year, without exception, of the date the city has knowledge of the incident giving rise to the disciplinary action.
Mm-hmm.
While not necessarily, and I don't believe, you know, I've done my research there, and, you know, I've lived in this city. There's not a ton of, you know, disciplinary actions I'm specifically aware of with ECPD. I do think, particularly for civil servants, this policy is a bit problematic if I understand it correctly. Could you maybe speak on it a little bit?
Sure. So what that requires is that from the point that misconduct comes to our attention, we have to complete our investigation within a year, with some statutory exceptions. There are some things that can postpone a personnel investigation. As an example, if an officer has been criminally charged in an incident and there's also a policy violation, we get to wait on our personnel investigation until the results of the criminal investigation have been concluded. But for most misconduct, it gives the city a 1-year timeline to investigate the incident and notify the employee that they're going to be disciplined. Now, what a Skelly hearing is an opportunity for an officer to appeal a recommended discipline. It's also an opportunity for them to present their side of the story. And it's also required by California statute that they be provided this opportunity. So let's just go through a possible example. Let's say an officer committed some misconduct in May of 2019. We didn't find out about the misconduct until July 2nd of 2019. We have a year from July 2nd to investigate the conduct and determine whether or not that officer should be disciplined. If we plan to discipline the officer, let's say we want to give the officer a week off without pay, we have to tell them before a year is up. At that point, they have the right to a Skelly hearing. So what that hearing is they have the right to appeal that intended discipline to me as the chief of police, and I am obligated to hear their side of the story and take that into account before imposing whatever the discipline might be. So after a Skelly hearing, I could modify the discipline. I could make it less. I could uphold it. It could be potentially more, depending on what they tell me. But I have to allow them the opportunity to basically plead their case in person to me before the discipline can actually be imposed. So before we actually make them take the week off, they have to have the opportunity to speak to me about it. I will say one of the things in the contract, and this is something that I've heard as a theme for police unions that people feel is problematic, and I personally also feel it's a problematic component to contracts, is the idea that there is binding arbitration. So some police associations have a clause that requires binding arbitration on discipline cases. So if they appeal the chief's position, the chief's decision, they can take it to an arbitrator, and the arbitrator can then overturn the chief's decision. In the case of El Cerrito, there is no binding arbitration clause. If they disagree with my decision on the discipline, they can appeal it to the city manager. If the city manager upholds it, they can appeal it to the city council. If the city council upholds it, they can appeal it to the civil service board. But they don't have the option of taking it to an arbitrator and imposing discipline on us through that avenue. And I believe that is a better system for employee discipline. I want to check back in with Mr. Rodriguez. Did I address your question with that response?
Yeah, you did. Thank you. Okay, do you mind if I ask a quick follow-up question and then a second question?
Sure. Let's go for it.
Sorry, I know there are other folks that want to be.
We still have an hour left, so we got time.
Yeah. With the state law you referred to, is that the practice of qualified immunity? I think you referred to the idea that basically this disciplinary action, this article is upheld, you know, and the, why am I trying to say this? Basically, this city article in the memorandum of understanding is upheld by some state law. I guess I'm asking which state law that is. Just
what is the? I normally have it off the top of my head.
It's only in the government code.
It's in the California Government Code. It is commonly known as the Peace Officer Bill of Rights. And
got it. Okay.
So that is different than qualified immunity, however. Qualified immunity is an entirely different concept. That is a protection for governmental employees afforded by the United States Supreme Court, and it has to be done through a United States Supreme Court process. So qualified immunity is a different concept altogether. So
got it. Okay.
Qualified immunity is basically more along the lines that a government employee, not just police officers, but governmental employees as a group, can be exempt from being personally liable for a constitutional violation if it was not clearly established that their conduct represented an established constitutional violation. So because the law is constantly evolving and changing with every Supreme Court decision, there are things that happen with governmental employees. Right now, police officers are the main topic around qualified immunity, where it hasn't been established through federal law or state law or previous Supreme Court decisions or previous Supreme Court guidance. If somebody does a behavior that is outside of those established guidelines, the first person that does that may be afforded qualified immunity by the United States Supreme Court so that they are not personally liable. That doesn't mean that the organization they work for may not still be liable for the violation. It just means that because it wasn't clear that this was a constitutional violation, we're not going to hold the individual liable. We may very well still hold the city or the library or the county or the state liable for the violation. I hope that helps.
Thanks for clearing that up. My last, final question was if you would, and a slight trigger warning for folks in the attendance, if you would speak on the sexual harassment allegation against a former El Cerrito police officer.
I will say that our city does not condone sexual harassment. We do a lot of training around it. We have very high standards for hiring people. I can't speak publicly about it because it is an ongoing court process, so there is active litigation in place. But however, at some point in the future, I may be able to talk more about the lawsuit. So sorry, I can't talk more.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. Next up, I have a question in chat from Bonnie McKenzie. It says, Paul, I like that, Paul. How realistic do you think it is to have social workers and the like respond to 911 calls about domestic disturbances and substance abuse? Well, I think the challenge is that I believe a lot of the reasons why the police are tasked with responding to domestic disturbances and substance abuse and homelessness and mental health crisis is that there are not a lot of people out there that are clamoring to do the same work. For substance abuse, I know that there are a lot of outpatient opportunities available, and we really do try to direct people in that regard so that it's not a police response. I think that our county's district attorney is really trying to treat substance abuse as a societal ill and not a criminal ill. As far as social workers going out there, you know, if there was a county agency that had people that would go to people's homes, that might be realistic. I think instead what the county more expects and what a lot of the nonprofits expect is that you come to them for the resource. And it is realistic to expect somebody who is having problems in their marriage to, I think, seek out a group like Stand Against Domestic Violence. I also think it's realistic for someone who's suffering substance abuse for they or their families to reach out to county resources to help with that. I don't know that they're necessarily going to be keen about going to the houses of people without some level of protection involved. I will say from my experience as a police officer, things can get a little weird once you get inside people's houses. When you're out on the street, things can be pretty normal, but people have a different sense and should have a different sense of privacy and expectation that what happens in their home can be free from governmental interference. So things get different legally and socially once you're in people's homes. Okay, let's see, next up. Looks like Julie Brown. Are there requirements for officers to participate in ongoing training, such as continuing education hours to renew credentials, just like teachers who have to renew their credentials or other medical professionals who have to renew their license? Yes, there are. So officers have to participate in 20 hours of training on a 2-year basis. No, sorry, 24 hours of training on a 2-year basis to maintain their certificate to be a police officer. There are some exceptions for that. If an officer is out on some extended injury and is unable to attend training, then there can be some exceptions for that. But for most every agency, yes, the officers have to go through ongoing training. Now, some of the repercussions is if you don't go through ongoing training, you can lose your agency certification as a California post-certified agency. So there are ongoing credentials, and some of the talk right now is, can't there be a licensing program to be a police officer? Right now, we have a certification program where if you meet the list of certifications, haven't gone to a basic academy, having a year to 18 months of experience on the street, having passed through a training period, you get a basic certificate saying you can do law enforcement in California. The drawback to that system is that there currently isn't a mechanism in place to revoke that certificate from people who engage in significant misconduct. So one of the things they're looking at the state level is at a system where if someone is licensed or certificated, that they can have that revoked if they commit a particular offense that is a revocable offense. So other states have systems like that in place. California doesn't currently, but I know that is currently in the works at the state level. Let's see. Next up. What is the salary for police officers and others in the department? What I would like to do on that for Ms. Adams is refer you to our city's website. So the salary schedule for all city employees can be found in the human resources section on the city website. And it has every employee's salary range in the department, every different classification. There is also a website called Transparent California that is a non-governmental website that compiles a list of all public employees in the state of California and what they make in benefits and salary. So I would encourage you to take a look at those different resources. I have a question here on the right that says it's from Miguel Gravel. Is that one that's already been answered, or is that a new question? Maybe I'm missing it in the chat.
I was just trying to find that one. I don't see it either.
Let's see, maybe is it this? How do you document or where is the report of how the city is served in the different neighborhoods? Do you have a map so we can see this? So one of the services that we used to have up and running was we had a contract with a company called crimereports.com. At the end of 2016, beginning of 2017, we changed our records management system over to a different company, and our connection with the vendor we had at that time, which is through LexisNexis, I feel like I've been banging my head against the wall, and the employees here are probably smiling, but it has been a nightmare to try to get the company we have a contract with to get our mapping software back up and running. We're probably at the point where we're going to change vendors on it, but I don't currently have a mapping module so that you can see where crime happens in the town. Instead, we do have our police blotter that we put out to just try to give people an overview of these are the types of crimes that are happening, and this is generally speaking where they're happening in town. So I'm sorry that we don't have that mapping thing up. That is absolutely on one of our punch list things that we're trying to accomplish, and it's been a source of infinite frustration for me. Let's see.
Maybe just one little point of interest too is it comes up frequently. People say, I saw this action or I heard about that, and we've heard that tonight, and I didn't see it on the Nixle blotter. We do have a little disclaimer on there, but the reality is that is really just a fraction of what we're doing. We're averaging sometimes up to 25,000 calls for service a year. There certainly aren't that many things listed on Nixle. We put on things that are criminal arrests, things that maybe we think people would be interested in, but it's certainly not all inclusive. So we just want to make sure people are aware of that.
Yeah, and if an incident results in a crime and didn't result in a crime being reported or arrest, then a lot of times those interactions are not going to be represented on the blotter. It looks like maybe we have a new question from Leslie Adams. She has her hand raised.
Hi there. Actually, I didn't have my hand raised, I don't think, unless it got raised by accident.
Leslie, if you can just click the lower hand, that will take your name off of the list.
I thought I did that.
The next question, Chief, was from Beryl Walsh.
All right. Ms. Lopez, our executive assistant, if you know that question, would you be able to vocalize it for the group? I'm searching for it right now.
We go back up, let it move.
Oh, I found it. Never mind. Okay, here we go. It says, sorry, I've not found the raised hand button. That's okay. This is not really, my expertise either. Might I ask if the ECPD has a public use of force database? Is it online, and is there ethnic information included? We do track uses of force, and we have been talking as a group, and having a public report out on use of force has been one of the things that I've been wanting to start doing. I think that you will probably see in a relatively short period of time a kind of catch-up report on our use of force over the last 5 years. And then what I plan to do is have that part of our annual report that we create every year, where you'll have information on uses of force from the previous year. So you should be prepared to see that coming up. I will say that some of our use of force, I think, can be found online through the Open Justice portal. Any serious use of force that a department engages in, this is something that results in a serious injury, gets reported to the state, and the state maintains a database of those types of reports across the state. In the past years, we haven't had any uses of force that meet that threshold. That doesn't mean we haven't had uses of force. It just means that they've all resulted in minor or no injury to the people who force was used on. So that is something that is on our list that we want to execute on in the current year. And it's something that we want to incorporate into our normal year-round report out after that. Okay, let's see. I guess it just got marked as answered. It's a lot to keep track of. Maybe, do we have Tomi next? Is that the next?
Correct.
Person? Okay. Are Chief Keith and members of the ECPD willing to participate in a citywide listening session on racism and experience of Black El Cerrito residents and other people of color? I would like to hear more about that. And I think I would probably be willing to do that. I'd love to hear what that would look like and how something like that might come together. What I would ask you to do is, can you please send me an email so that we can talk to each other about what you have in mind and what that might look like. You can find my email on the police department website. For those of you that are on here and want to email me, it's pkeith at, and this is the hard part, ci.el-cerrito.ca.us. So I would like to hear more about what that listening session would look like. So thank you for bringing that forward, Tomi. Next up, we have Ali Doris. Hi, thank you for this session. Your later dated June 8th talked about 19 factors officers are required to consider before using force. How is this put into practice in a real situation? Is it realistic in quick decision-making situations? Well, some of the things that are involved in those 19 factors are factors like, how large is the person I'm dealing with? And how large am I? What is the perceived physical fitness level of the person I'm dealing with? What is the physical fitness level I feel I'm at? Is this person intoxicated? Is this person pregnant? I think is this person suffering a mental health crisis? I think these are all questions that we would, is the person armed with a weapon or is this person not armed with a weapon? Has this person committed a crime? If they've committed a crime, what's the severity of the crime? These are all questions that I would want people to ask. And I think that when I've talked about these 19 factors, these are factors that are reinforced through scenario-based training, through our use of force training and our firearms training, and use of force simulators, in live role-playing events, to reinforce all of the things our officers should be thinking about. The 19 factors are also not something that we just came up with. These are 19 factors that have been identified by case law through the US Supreme Court, through case law at the state level, legislatively, things that our officers must take into account. So they are all based on law in previous cases where officers have used force. There are some things out there like use of force continuums that try to make the decision-making a simple issue. And I don't like boiling things down into a simple black and white answer. If the person is violently resisting, then I should use this type of force. Because there are so many factors about what a person is doing that are more than just that position on a graphic. Is the person I'm dealing with maybe a 15-year-old? Are they, if it's me, are they physically small? Even if somebody is violently resisting me, if they are not physically a match for me, then I won't be using an impact weapon or a taser device on them. I'm going to try to handle the situation in a different way. And sometimes when we create use of force continuums, we can overly simplify what ought to be a robust and complex decision-making process that really takes a lot into account. Our officers have to do a lot of thinking in a short period of time. They would have to do that if they had a continuum. They'd have to do that if they have to take into account our 19 factors. My concern is that if we use something that oversimplifies it, officers may use an inappropriate level of force because it matched up on the continuum, even though what they're really seeing justifies a much lower level of force.
Chief, if you don't mind if I add something to this particular topic, Chief.
For those of you that came in late, this is Sergeant Ian Wong. He's our former investigations supervisor, and he's current watch commander.
Hi, thanks. Appreciate everyone participating today. Just listening into the conversations, we spoke a little bit about responses to mental health crisis or persons being unwanted or safety checks being needed on certain people. And the chief just spoke to a little bit about use of force. On the patrol side of things, we get calls obviously from dispatch. It's a very short amount of information that they're getting to us in a limited amount of time. One thing that we've put into practice is now our officers, the primary officer that is rolling to the calls, is reaching out to the caller to see what exactly is the person suffering from. If it's a mental health crisis, as recently as yesterday, we were able to not even respond to a call physically. We did it remotely, and we're able to address the issue and not even have to show up on scene. As far as crimes in progress as well, we're getting limited information, and we're talking about starting this de-escalation from the minute we're dispatched to the call. So we're having the responding officer get on the phone, and we're getting that extra information, like that dispatch may not have had the time or the knowledge to solicit that information from the caller. So our officers are making these calls, asking further clarifying questions in order to have a safe deployment to residences like residential burglaries or subjects with weapons. So we're trying to gather as much information as we can in a short amount of time. And that's something that we've been doing, and it's turned out very, very successful. And we're also able to get different resources by talking to people on the phone and not actually having to show up for the mental health stuff. It's really, it's worked great. We've been able to partner them up with some people to get them the resources and been able to take care of a lot of this stuff and really start the de-escalation process from the moment we get the call.
Okay, I see that Melissa Newton has her hand raised, and I don't think we've heard from her yet. So can we bring her on?
Hi, am I unmuted?
You are.
Hi. I've rented in El Cerrito for maybe 5 years, and we just recently bought our first home here. Very happy to be a part of our community. Thank you for having this public forum.
Sure.
My first question is regarding the necessity of weapon use for our police force. What are your efforts to reduce weapons availability and weapon use on the police force? And then to follow up, what initiatives could restrict deploying officers for nonviolent crimes? And what are you doing to expand those initiatives, both at the county and the city level? I know we talked a lot about the county and particularly the mental health response that the county provides and the resources that they provide, but the county is big and far away from us. So I want to know, what are we doing here? What is this city doing? And what do you think we could do?
So on the reduce weapon use topic, I think that some of the things we've done to reduce instances of use of force, and I'll say that as far as weapon use, the most common way that our officers use force is through physical techniques. Things like using a takedown technique or using a control hold. These are things that they accomplish with their hands, and that is the vast majority of how our officers use force. Using things like a taser is somewhat more rare. Just as an example, last year we had 15 uses of force. In those incidents, tasers were used 5 times. So it's about a third of the time last year. And most frequently, officers use things like control holds or takedown techniques. So they already, at least in my opinion, they don't use the different types of tools that much. It's pretty rare for us to use pepper spray. I'd say it's very rare that an officer actually uses their baton to control a suspect. The most common way we take somebody into custody, and this is in about 98% of arrest situations, is just by talking to people and putting them into handcuffs. That is how 98% of the people get arrested in El Cerrito. Some of the things we've done to reduce instances of use of force is we've looked at how we respond to calls and what we respond to. Some of the ways that I believe have been effective in reducing use of force incidents is changing how we respond to low-level offenses, things like petty theft. A trend that we picked up on from 2017 is that this is after petty theft had been decriminalized by a proposition, that officers were still responding in a very significant way to things like petty theft. And our officers would get there and the suspect would be running across the parking lot. We would go and we would try to stop the person. Inevitably, if someone's already running, they're usually not going to stop when you talk to them. Our officers would end up having to tackle somebody or do a takedown technique to take them into custody. They would generate a use of force report. And then once we would bring them over to the store frequently wouldn't want prosecution. They would only want their property back, leaving the only crime being the resisting arrest charge. That is not a good outcome for us, and that is not what we wanted our officers experiencing. So we changed our response to those calls to minimize the chances that our officers were going to be in this foot pursuit situation over what the state has decided is a relatively minimal crime. I will say that the other big thing that we use to try to reduce uses of force and or to make sure that our uses of force are appropriate is that every incident resulting in a takedown report or a takedown hold or something more significant gets reviewed by a use of force review board. The board reviews the use of force to determine, is the use of force a policy? Is the use of force reasonable? Are there training issues that came out of this? Are there more significant issues that need to be investigated by our internal affairs division? The results of their review go to the captain for review and also go to the chief for review. So the captain and I look at every significant use of force in town, and that's basically anything from a takedown, the use of an elbow as a personal impact weapon, pepper spray, taser use, batons, shootings, the use of the wrap device as an immobilizing device. Any of those techniques results in a review of the incident and a chain of command review of the results of the board. So sending somebody other than sworn officers for nonviolent crimes. We have a community service officer program where we send non-sworn officers out to investigate incidents that don't have a suspect in custody. I will say that in my experience, when someone is detained for a nonviolent crime, that is not necessarily a guarantee that their behavior is going to remain nonviolent when the police become involved. So when an arrest is taking place, there's a reason why you use a sworn officer. The state of California actually requires a sworn officer be the person to accept that arrest from someone who's placing somebody under arrest. It has to be a person who's certified as a peace officer. We don't like sending non-armed and non-equipped people to handle arrest situations because we may have something that is initially presents itself as a nonviolent crime. Maybe it's a shoplifter in custody by store security who stole something from the store. That is definitely a low-level crime, but when we get there, we may very well find out that this is a person who is a parolee, maybe they're a wanted parolee, maybe their criminal history is that they've engaged in quite violent incidents. That is a possibility that isn't necessarily all that rare. So I would not feel comfortable sending somebody into an arrest situation if they're not properly equipped. And that is where I do believe that our police association would rightfully say, we want a part of this decision-making to see if this is the right direction to go. So there are things that, and that would be something that we would have to discuss and get agreement from the police association. I'm not saying that we would never do that, but I don't know if that would be the right response, even though the crime might be nonviolent. There was a second part of the question about getting county resources here. The option isn't necessarily that it only comes from the county. There are other regional efforts that we could engage in with some of our neighboring agencies. Agencies like Richmond and San Pablo, who we share a lot of commonalities with the populations that we serve and the geography and the makeup of our communities. So there might be better resources at that regional level. I will say that our city is not a wealthy city. Our city is in the middle of a budget crisis. The police department has taken on 10% in cuts, mostly through freezing personnel positions. So, the things like this would also cost money that we would have to really sit down and analyze where we might find funding for regional efforts about homelessness or non-police officer responses to mental health. Next question kind of goes into what I just said. Has ECPD given up on shoplifting calls, or is response available but smaller? I'm guessing is what that means. We haven't given up on shoplifting calls. We're a lot more thoughtful when we do go, though. Before we get somebody in custody, we want to know some key pieces of information. Did a crime actually occur? Like, did someone see a crime occur? And is there somebody here at the store in a position of leadership or responsibility that actually wants us to do something about it? Sometimes we'll go to a store and, by God, yeah, somebody saw the crime occur, but nobody at the store wants anything done about it. So there's no reason for us to go out and stop a person and handcuff them and take them into custody if the store actually doesn't want anything done about it. There's other times where, darn it, the store wants us to do something about this person, but we can't actually substantiate that a crime occurred. So the reason we do that ahead of time is so that we don't already have a person in handcuffs before we realize that nobody actually saw the person take merchandise out of the store. So we still do respond to shoplifting calls, and we still arrest people for shoplifting, but we make sure that there's certain criteria that is met before we subject somebody to detention or arrest. Next up, I see, I'm going to take a question on the right here, and then we'll go to Sam Peel, who has his hand up. Question is, how many officers are Black? What do you do to make sure your officers are culturally competent to be able to handle persons of color in the community and those just passing through? So we have 39 officers, and 10.2% of our officers identify as Black. What do you do to make sure officers are culturally competent? The main strategy I use for cultural competency, other than training that officers go through in the academy and ongoing professional training around bias and racial profiling, is that I really focus on hiring people that come from our local area. They don't necessarily have to come from El Cerrito, but I want to make sure that our officers are coming from a community that has diverse population, that they've spent their life engaging with people that are different from them. We talk about, in the police academies, they often have cultural projects where they ask recruits to go out and meet communities that are different than their own. But I want to see that they have lived their life in a state of being surrounded by people that are different from them, and that they've managed to have productive relationships with those around them. So I look for cultural competency when we're evaluating candidates. I give a lot of value to people that bring something different to our agency and bring a diverse element to our agency, because diversity happens out in our communities, and it also happens in our agency. The more people can see those who are unlike them and realize that we are actually much more similar than we are different, the better off our officers are. So hiring people from the community is the #1 part of that, but also checking when they come in here to make sure, is this person culturally competent? And along the way, making sure that they are getting it reinforced that we are here to serve the community, and that just because somebody looks different, just because somebody comes from a different city than El Cerrito, doesn't mean that they're any less a part of our community. All right, I kind of got preachy there, but that is how I feel. Sam Peel has his hand up. Can we activate him, please, or her, please? All right, you're unmuted.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, I really appreciate you taking the time to hold this today. I've got 2 questions. The first is related to the shooting that happened at Waldo in Richmond recently. I live right down the street. It's pretty terrifying, and I know that you're looking for surveillance video, but how will we know what you're able to learn from that, whatever investigation ensues? That's my first question. And my second question is related to home surveillance cameras, or basically looking for your basically data or opinion from El Cerrito and the effectiveness of protecting a home with the use of various types of cameras.
Okay, so I do agree. I think we may be at a point on the investigation to the shooting of the house on Richmond Street, where if we have some additional information, it might be time to release it. I'm not sure that we do. I know that we do have a forensic evidence process that is currently underway for ballistics analysis, and I don't know where that's at. So I don't want to say that we necessarily do have additional information to share, but I'm going to check in with our current investigation sergeant to see where we're at on that, and if we have something that we can release to the public about where we're at on suspects. On home surveillance cameras, I would say that home surveillance cameras can serve two primary purposes. The first one is that a home surveillance camera can act as a deterrent for crime. It can, a person who's coming up, maybe intending to steal a package off the porch, maybe intending to burglarize the house, might see a visible camera and decide, I don't want to break into this house. I don't want to be caught on camera breaking into this house. I don't want to get caught for the crime. So there's a deterrent element, I believe, to surveillance cameras if they're prominently visible on the front of a house. There's another element to cameras that can be used to apprehend suspects. So it doesn't necessarily stop the crime from happening, but it helps us identify the person after the fact. We have had some cases where we've had good results from surveillance cameras. The one that just jumps to my mind, this house, I think it was on Cutting Boulevard, got broken into. These two guys go up to the door and they look at the camera and then knock the camera off, but the camera had already recorded them. And the guys were wearing very distinctive clothing. And wouldn't you know, I think it was the next day or 2 days later, an officer was driving down the street in generally the same neighborhood, sees the person wearing the exact same clothes he was wearing on the day of the burglary, and it did lead to us apprehending him. Now, things like people stealing packages off porches, you know, realistically, we don't catch a ton of people based on that porch video. Those people are, I believe, stealing things off porches in a wide geographic area. So it is hard for just us in El Cerrito to be able to match that same person up. They could be from Antioch or, you know, Manteca or somewhere in Solano County. I'm just throwing out cities that are far away. They could be from cities far away, just coming through the Bay Area, looking for packages and then leaving again. So it's not as helpful for that, but residential burglars do tend to stay closer. And we have had some good results in using video footage of a burglar to make a case later on and hold them accountable. There are lots of different options out there for home surveillance cameras. There's things that you can store on site, and if you have technical know-how, that might be a possibility. There's other ones that stream to an online server. In my experience, those have been much more user-friendly when residents have had those types of systems. So there's definitely a lot there. If you want to send me an email, I can connect you with somebody here that can maybe answer some more of your questions about surveillance cameras. But the Richmond Street shooting is still under investigation. We do have evidence work that's currently being undertaken with the Contra Costa Crime Lab, and hopefully we will have some information to share about that coming up. Okay, let's see. I've got, okay, we've got a question from Miguel Espino. So maybe we can go to Mr. Espino and activate the microphone. Great.
Yeah, it's me again.
Oh, right. Sorry, I'm just going.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, I know it's been kind of interesting process. I wasn't sure whether to chat or raise my hand.
Sure.
And this goes back, actually, it's a little related to what you were just talking about. When I was looking at the annual report, I noted that it looked like larceny and thefts are like your #1 stat for crimes, and, you know, and it's quite a bit. So do you have a stat on how much recovery you have of those thefts?
Typically property crimes are the biggest bulk of police department crime stats. Violent crime is definitely less rare than property crime. Property crime is anything from retail shoplifting to breaking into cars to stealing cars to breaking into businesses. One of the best ways to look at information on total crimes as well as clearances for crimes and clearance rates is through the Open Justice portal of the California Department of Justice.
Okay.
So if you type Open Justice into your browser, it'll take you to this whole portal. And you can look at any city in the state. We all submit our clearance rates and our crime rates to the state. You can compare cities. If you go to crime and clearance as the topic on that website, it'll bring you to a menu where you can put in El Cerrito. You can see our clearance rates for 10 years, our crime rate for 10 years. It's really helpful.
Great. And just one quick question also. I think it's Senate Bill 4321 about personnel records. Do you know if that's in effect or if that's still like in the courts?
So that's SB 1421, I think that you're talking about, where certain types of previous. Sorry, go ahead.
I thought it was 4321. Is it 1421?
I think it was 1421. So that was passed, I believe, January of 2019 is when that went into effect. Basically, what SB 1421 did is it took certain classifications of personnel complaints and outcomes of those and made them public documents instead of confidential documents. So at El Cerrito, we have complied with that and we put our records on our website just because people were asking, and we thought it would be easier just to have an online portal where people could see all of our applicable records that apply to SB 1421. I don't know if there are agencies that are still challenging 1421 or going through court processes about it, but we posted all of our documents that are relevant online.
I think there was only one record. Okay.
There's a couple of records. It involves the other associated records are things like officer-involved shootings. But if there are only a couple of records, that is because those are the records that we possess that are related to that type of investigation.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, I have, I think I might have answered Miguel Gravel's question. So maybe Ms. Lopez can help with this because I see he's at the top of the list. That was willingness to be part of the California State Report Card, and that was something that I'd certainly be willing to do if they wanted us on there. Let's see, moving down to Kathleen Sullivan. I'm going to see if I can, looks like that question was about positions being currently filled. I think I got that one too. And sorry, I'm trying to go through and get these as we're just wrapping up.
I believe Sarah Klauser is the next question on the list.
Okay. Give me a second, Sarah.
I'm happy to read them if you'd like.
That would be great. I cannot find it.
Sure, certainly. What measures could we take to make policing more transparent for the public? What do you see as the benefit and challenges in creating a civilian oversight board?
I think that the main challenge for a civilian oversight board is making sure that you have people that are willing to do it and put the time and the energy into doing it, combined with making sure that the city has the budget and the legal support to make sure that whatever the oversight board sees, that we're not violating the law or increasing liability for the city or the board members as part of their oversight. I think there are a lot of things, and one of the things I talked about today that has been something that has kind of been on the side burner for me is putting out more informative documents around things like department use of force. We try to put out an annual report every year to get people up to speed on some of the big things we've been working on. But there are certainly initiatives in those types of areas where we can give more information, and we ought to. One of the things I talked about at the council meeting on the 16th was some deployment decisions we've made and what some of those outcomes have been. And I think that we've achieved some really remarkable results in reducing disparities in El Cerrito. And I will take responsibility for not highlighting that earlier in the year. I wanted to have a whole year of data under our belt before we pushed information out to the public. But I have to say the COVID-19 pandemic got in the way of some of that. and also trying to put together the words of how to describe that even if arrests are falling dramatically in town, that can be a good thing that has positive outcomes for groups that are part of our community. So I would say that one way to make sure the departments are being more transparent is make sure your city council members are saying, Chief, tell us what you're doing about this, and getting it out there in public. I am committing to trying to do more to get the word out about things that we're doing and the impacts they're having. But there are some other ways that I think as an annual basis, we can do a better job of highlighting what your police department has been up to. Some of the things that we've done out there, I want to make sure people have opportunities to ask questions, make comments, but we have a drone program that's currently in use. If you're ever curious about what we've been flying drones for, or whether or not that was our drone you saw in the sky, at the end of every month, we report out on everything we used our drone for. Some months it's nothing, some months it's for doing a search for a residential burglary suspect, or maybe doing evidence work. We do try to put out things like that. We're planning on putting out a report on our use of force statistics, so that people have a better and more informed idea of when we use force, why we use force, and what type of force we use. One of the things that I mentioned earlier, if I'm not sure if you were currently on there, is that we use force in about 2 to 3% of arrest situations. To me, that is, if I think about the people I know in my life and the people I've known that might be people who would be subject to arrest, I can imagine that 2 to 3 out of every 100 people I know in the category of people who might be arrested might not want to be arrested and might run from the cops when the cops come to try to arrest them. But that is a measurement that I think will be helpful for the public if the public wants to do comparative work to look at how other agencies engage in force and at what rates other agencies engage in force. So we're going to work on getting that out. Let's see. I have Jeannie next, and I have located the question for this one. I have concern about poor Black and brown people who are pulled over or targeted by police disproportionately to search for drugs when data shows drug usage is equal between all races. Do you have data on the demographics of people you pull over or search? So we do have good demographic data on the people that we issue tickets for. I will have to do a deep dive on people we pull over or search. We should have demographic data on the people we search. That is a category that we require our officers to write a report on. I don't have that at hand right now, but that is something I can commit to looking into and seeing if we can get some feedback. Jeannie, if you want to send me an email directly, we can communicate on getting you some information that you're looking for. One of the things that we do take a close look at are the demographics of our traffic tickets that we issue, because I feel that that is a good way to get an idea of the population of people that are getting pulled over in El Cerrito and what the outcomes of those stops are. Let's see, we've got Scott.
Chief, we actually did skip over one from Denise Inkster.
Okay.
If you were in charge of the budget for one day and could have any new or expand an existing resource, what would it be and why?
I would tell you, Denise, it would be $40 million for a new public safety building, but I don't think that's going to happen. I would say that our number one biggest need is a modern public safety building that represents how our officers and I feel about our community. I want a public safety building that has community meeting spaces, that has more flexibility for the type of missions that police departments handle now, that is technologically up to date, that is seismically up to date. Oh, and I have a lieutenant here who's saying the number one thing is that it's a building that represents how much we value our female employees. Right now, if you were to come into this public safety building and do a real in-depth tour of it, you'll find that the facilities, when they designed this building in 1960, are absolutely inferior when it comes to our women employees. They are just not up to snuff. And it is a continual source of embarrassment for me that our female employees have the facilities that they have in this building, and that there's no good solution for how to change it. So 100%, if I had, the unfortunate thing is if I had control of it, then probably nothing else would be funded other than a public safety building project. And it's not just the police employees, it's also the employees, the women employees of our fire department. The facilities were never even considered that there would be, when they built it in 1960, it's clear they never thought that women would be police officers. They definitely never thought women would be firefighters. It was a completely different time. I'm glad that we're in the modern era. I wish our building was in the modern era. Okay. I could go on for hours about the public safety building.
Chief, I do have questions that were in the chat that didn't make it to the Q&A if you want me to ask those.
Yes, let's see. Let's get to the people who have their hand up that maybe didn't get a chance to speak, and then we'll go into the chat questions, and we're getting close to the time on this.
The only hand left up is Jacqueline Torres. The rest of the questions are in the Q&A or the chat.
Oh, great. So let's go to Jacqueline Torres, and then we'll go to the rest of the chat questions.
Hi, yeah, thank you. So I'm how you track and interrupt patterns of behavior among officers that might be concerning. So I think some community members talked about of inappropriate yelling, so not arriving at the level of inappropriate use of force, but even patterns of behavior or incidents of behavior that we know are contagious, and that one of the a lot of research has shown that interrupting those patterns can have a big impact, because otherwise, if it's shown to, if it's demonstrated to be okay to yell at, a community member just, because they're inebriated, then that is contagious. So the first part is, how do you interrupt patterns of behavior and track those? And then also, I know you mentioned in your email several weeks ago about reviewing with officers about, how they might interrupt, and kind of reassuring, talking about how they would interrupt when they saw a fellow officer, acting inappropriately, using inappropriate use of force. And, whether there are systematic things that you're doing to kind of promote that culture of being able to be an upstander and be able to speak out. And then whether there are examples that you see in your department that give you reassurance that that's actually something that people feel comfortable doing. And so, those two dimensions of interrupting, both what you do to interrupt on behavior patterns or even incidents, and then what you see and what you're doing to enable fellow officers to interrupt concerning behavior.
So the two biggest tools we have to respond to, let's say, examples like we heard earlier, and there's a reason I wrote them down, is when our community brings them to our attention, because often it might be a single officer or two officers at a call, and I'm not necessarily there. So it's when residents bring it to our attention, and the fact that our officers wear body-worn cameras. So it has happened on more than one occasion that a person has reported to me that they felt like an interaction was handled inappropriately or should have been done differently. And we've looked at the body-worn camera footage and agreed with the person, and then used the body-worn camera footage as a tool to correct and change an officer's behavior. It is a remarkable tool to have somebody listen to how they sound, to see the physical, body language reaction of a person they're talking to understand how the way they approach the situation could have been done much better and much more effectively. So I found it to be, with some officers, a really effective tool to hone their approach, to change how they respond to a call. I've also found it to be an effective tool that if officers cannot correct their behavior, to use it as a tool to get them to leave the organization, whether that's through termination or additional training or progressive discipline. So I think body-worn cameras are our biggest ally in interrupting behavior that is problematic behavior from an officer. Now, sometimes people will say that I was, the officer acted rudely or didn't treat me right, and we look at the body-worn camera, and it might reinforce that it seems like the officer actually did handle this correctly. But there have absolutely been times since we started body-worn cameras in 2018 where it has served as a very valuable moment for our officers to see how they came across in the interaction and how they can do it better. So as far as intervention, I will say that as part of our use of force, it is part of the training that we train our officers in, especially when it comes to prone control. And the most frequent times I've seen officers intervene, and when I personally have intervened, is in prone control situations. So when a suspect's on the ground, there frequently are more than one officer engaged in the effort of trying to control a person. And I have found it to be the reality that an officer on the ground may be attempting a technique, but because they don't have the full picture, they may not realize how their technique is either ineffective or more extreme than the situation calls for. So we do train officers to physically intervene when something is being done wrong, to move people out of the way, to take over positions if what the person's doing is not effective. There is scenario training that involves intervention. I would have never thought that I would have to train officers like in the situation with the murder of George Floyd to, for God's sake, step in and stop that from happening. But that is a video that we've shown to all our officers, and that is a discussion that we have had with every team at our department about the necessity of taking action when you see that happening. At the academy, I can tell you that when officers receive their training, there's a big block of instruction on intervention. We talk about the things that keep a person from intervening, and a lot of the things that keep an officer from intervening are the same things that keep the public from intervening when they see things happen. Officers may feel like they don't have enough information to intervene. They may be psychologically unprepared. They'd never considered what would happen in this particular incident. So then when the incident happens, they're completely psychologically unprepared to intervene. They may not feel like they have a full understanding of what they're seeing. So the same things that go through our minds when we're just normal residents out on the street and we see something happening, and afterwards we think, geez, I wanted to do something. These are the same things that our officers have to combat as well. So the ways we try to train that is through scenario-based training, through group discussions, through visual examples where officers go through the decision-making process of how they would intervene. And it's not just in use of force, but intervening across the whole range of problematic ethical behavior. So that it's not just when they see the use of force, it's also when they see a gratuity happening. It's also when they see theft happening. It's when they see misconduct happening, period. We did get a question from on the email about making sure officers are supported when they come forward and report misconduct. And you may think that everything that we investigate must just come from our community and must be the main driver for complaints of officer misconduct. But a large portion of the investigations we conduct are internally generated complaints against employees. It's when one employee sees something that another employee did and thinks what they did was wrong. So our officers have demonstrated that they can come forward when they see something wrong, and that we try to demonstrate that we will objectively investigate the incident and then take appropriate disciplinary action when we see that we find misconduct. I believe that the number of times internal complaints come up demonstrates that our officers are willing to do that intervention, even if it's a delayed intervention. But it is something that you have to support. I think that the number one thing that you have to do is that when an officer does successfully intervene, you need to be there to support the officer's decision and what they did. And you don't want the officer to feel that they're getting punished for bringing an issue forward. So I would say that in that area, that is the most challenging thing, is to make sure that someone feels that they're supported, because like we've seen, there can be institutional barriers, there can be psychological barriers of bringing something forward. So when they take the leap and they come forward, we want to make sure that they feel that their concerns are being fairly and adequately addressed. And they, in the moment, if they make the call and say that I think this is excessive, and they move in and do it, even if we find out that it wasn't excessive later when we do a full review of the incident, that we still support them for making the call in the field using their judgment that what was happening was too much or the wrong technique. So that is, if you want to change any culture, then you need to support it when things go right. So from our standpoint, that is what we want to support, is when people come forward with wrongdoing or when they take action, when they see perceived wrongdoing, that we're there to support their decision making. All right, we have some written down questions. We're also at our time limit. So I'm going to see if I've got some things that maybe we haven't addressed well in our responses yet. Who are the people that compose the review board when we do a use of force review board? And do they include majority Black folks and people of color who live in El Cerrito? So our use of force review boards are internal review boards that are conducted by supervisors as well as subject matter experts in use of force. And it is an internal process, and in our case, it is not an external process. Does El Cerrito have nuisance abatement laws that require and encourage businesses to report issues such as shoplifting? We do encourage businesses to report shoplifting. As I said, we definitely have a tempered response to shoplifting calls, but we take reports, we make arrests, especially when we have people that are repeatedly stealing from the same store over and over again. We try to work with businesses to get things in place like trespassing cases, and that we try to address the habitual offenders. I mean, there are people that come into stores and every day they're going to steal a sandwich. That's just the nature of theft and crime in California. We talked about that. Almost to the end here. Are you confident we will not have a George Floyd, Elijah McCain, Breonna Taylor, and El Cerrito giving the training, etc., of our officers and PD staff? I am confident we have top-notch officers that are well-trained and have solid decision-making. Will a tragedy never befall El Cerrito? There is always the possibility in police work that a tragedy will happen through, that is out of our control. What I commit to and what our police department commits to is to be on the constant alert for how we need to do things differently, to be open to changing the way we do things, to reduce the likelihood that a tragedy like that will befall our community. When we have incidents like George Floyd, Elijah McCain, Breonna Taylor, we look at our practices and say, how is El Cerrito represented in this incident? And it's not just when we have a fatal tragedy, it's for policing incidents across the country that make the news for how an agency might have done something wrong. We look at those things with a risk management perspective and we say, what about how we are doing our job right now makes us at risk to have the same thing happen here? What are the things that we're doing that make us at lower risk? And what do we need to put in place? What conversations do we need to have? What training do we need to institute? What do we need to raise people's awareness of to reduce the likelihood that a tragedy like that will happen? I would love to promise that we're never going to have a tragic police incident in El Cerrito. I believe that we have top-notch officers, and they're the reason that as the chief, as a person who lives in El Cerrito, that I can go home at night and I can close my eyes and I can rest easy at night, because I know that we have high caliber and high character officers on the street at night, and that they're going to make decisions that are going to try their best to make sure that they resolve the situation safely for themselves and that they resolve the situation safely for the people involved, and that they resolve the situation safely for the person that needs to be arrested. So I know that we have those types of people working here, and the thing that helps reinforce that in me the most is the fact that when I come and talk to them about challenging topics, things like disparate treatment, disparate outcomes of different groups in El Cerrito, that they listen and that they change how they do their job as a result. So we hire smart people that understand how their actions have repercussions in our community, and they care and they want to make things better. All right, that may have been the last one. I hope I got everybody's questions. There was one about how many El Cerrito cops live in town. There's a couple of us. There's a lot more cops that live in the West Contra Costa County area. And then there's some other amount of police officers that work here that live beyond that. I would love for every officer to live in El Cerrito, but I will say that not every officer's dream house is my dream house. I have a relatively small El Cerrito house, and some of our officers like bigger houses farther out in the burbs, and I can't really blame them. I like my house just fine, but it's a typical tiny El Cerrito house where I have to have the kids leave the house with their mom if I want to have a Zoom meeting at home. All right, so I want to thank everybody for coming on. I'm really blown away by the number of attendees and the thoughtful things that were brought forward. I want to thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to be with us here live. And if you're watching this recorded, then thank you for taking the time to hear some things from your police department and also to hear things from your fellow community members. El Cerrito is just a wonderful part of the Bay Area and a wonderful part of the state, and it is my great honor to be the chief here. So thank you all for participating today, and I hope that the next time we have one of these that you'll also participate in that. Have a good evening and have a good 4th of July. And for the city clerk, I think we can